Wonderful. Good afternoon, everybody. Good morning to those of you joining from North America, and welcome to today's Spotlight Series event. Don't miss a beat, navigating the complex world of trackers. By way of brief introduction, my name is David Koch. I am a senior audience marketing manager here at Relative Insight, and I will be your host for today's session. Just a little bit of housekeeping. This is a hybrid event, so we have people joining us online as well as in the room here in London. For those of you in the room here with us, if you need the facilities, just down the stairs and to your left. In terms of an agenda for today's session, I'm going to start off talking a little bit about what we mean when we say tracker. So I'm going to set the scene for a conversation today before turning it over to our expert panel for what I'm sure will be a spirited discussion about their experiences with tracking. As always, we're going to save lots of time for Q&A at the end. So for those of you online, please do use the Q&A functionality in Zoom to send your questions in. And for those of you in the room here, we'll make sure that your questions get answered as well. So with that out of the way, it won't just be me speaking up here for the whole hour today. I'm very happy to be joined by four others. We have Lindsay Clausen joining us from US Pharmacopoeia. We have Sam Ballantyne here with us in the room from Collibra, and Kirsten Federkey from Lipman Hearne. And moderating our panel today is going to be our very own Amy O'Baker. But before I turn it over to them, let's set the scene for the discussion today by first agreeing on what we actually mean when we say tracker. And it's a very broad term that is essentially used to describe a tool for understanding how something of interest is changing over time. And I think changing over time is the really important element here. And in terms of what trackers are useful for and why tracking matters, first and foremost, it gives you a way to visualize your data in a way that is easy to understand and in a way that is conducive to decision making. So it's going to help you spot and visualize changes. Secondly, tracking can help you distinguish between trends and flashpoint issues. And I think the thing to remember here is that when you're making decisions, you want to focus on the structural problems or opportunities that are facing your business or your organization. And when this kind of analysis is done on an ad hoc basis, oftentimes something that is just a flashpoint problem, a blip, or an outlier can distort your line of thinking and cause you to focus on the wrong thing. So by taking sort of a continual view of your performance over time, trackers can help you focus on the things that really matter. And thirdly, tracking can help you assess impact. So as a time-based tracking tool, you can imagine it's easy to sort of plot the date that you've made a particular change and then look from that time forward to see whether the change has had the desired effect. And this could be everything from changing your sales strategy and expecting to see growth in top line revenue to changing how you approach customer service with an eye to improving perceptions of your brand. And trackers can help you do all of these things. So what you're seeing up here is a few common examples of trackers. And as you can probably tell, there is no one size fits all approach. On the left hand of our spectrum here, we have sort of simple quantitative tracking. And this, you might not even call these trackers, right? It just might be your KPI dashboard or whatever it may be. But on this end of things, you have tracking revenue, tracking churn, tracking the number of pitches done. And when we're talking about this kind of tracking, it's quite simple, right? It's numbers that can pretty easily be modeled, visualized in graphs to make decisions based on. But where it gets more complex is as we move across the spectrum to the right here. Things like tracking brand perception, brand awareness, customer feedback. And this is the world where you get into combining quant and qual data, and that's where tracking can get challenging. And that's really where we're going to focus the discussion today. So The other thing that I always like to say is that if you track everything, you're going to end up tracking nothing. And I think this underpins the importance of focusing on the things that you, A, have the ability to influence, and B, that relate to your core objectives. Because I think we've all been in a situation where it's like, oh, I want to know this and that and the other. But what you do in those situations is you split your attention across too many different things. So, the first step in effective tracking is always being intentional and thoughtful about what it is you actually want to track. Now, you might be wondering, why have we decided to host an event on this particular topic? And as you may already know, at Relative Insight, we've recently launched our approach to tracking, which we call Heartbeat. And to put it simply, what Heartbeat allows you to do is to track how the composition of a particular conversation of interest is changing over time. It allows you to define the themes that you care about in those conversations, and then visualize how the frequency of conversation, or the volume of conversation rather, dedicated to those topics is changing over time. And what you're seeing up here on the screen, this is an example of a Heartbeat chart we've put together for the public discourse around electric vehicles. And you can see we've defined themes relating to appearance, affordability, supply chain, all these sorts of things. And we can see how that conversation is changing to inform our marketing strategy if we're an electric vehicle firm. Now, of course, this is just one of many approaches to tracking. There's no one size fits all approach. And I'm sure as we get into the panel today, we're going to hear about a lot of different approaches. So with that, it is my pleasure to introduce you to our esteemed panel of experts for today. So here we have Lindsay Clausen, who is the Knowledge Strategy Director at US Pharmacopoeia. She brings 15 years of experience supporting medicine safety at the FDA and at USP. And over the last couple of years, she's been leading USP's COVID response initiative, working with global teams to aid in the efficient dissemination of quality vaccines to millions. So Lindsay, thank you for all the important work that you've been doing these past couple of years, helping to keep us all safe. Really excited to hear about your experience. Joining us in the room here today is Sam Ballantyne, who leads employee experience at Collibra, which is a tech unicorn focused on changing how people use data. And Sam specializes in listening strategies to support cultural change, values development, leadership development, and internal communications. And last, but certainly not least, we have Kirsten Federkey, who is a senior vice president at Lipman Hearne. And Kirsten brings a unique perspective from her 20-year communications career, where she's worked with nonprofits to help them identify unique strengths and then turn those strengths into real results. So thank you all so much for joining us today. Moderating our panel today is going to be Relative Insight's very own Amy O'Baker, who I'm sure many of you have interacted with over your time. So I will now pass it over to Amy and the panel.
Hello, everybody. Kirsten and Lindsay, can you hear me okay? Is this volume all right? Lovely.
Yes.
Okay.
A little bit quiet.
A little bit quiet, so I'm going to speak really loudly. And
okay.
Okay, so Lindsay, we'll start with you. So please, can you tell us what are your experiences of tracking using Relative Insight?
Certainly. So I've been in touch with Relative Insight over the years, and last year when I began working on the COVID project, I reached out and I talked to my account rep at the time and said, what could we put together that would help me monitor the landscape for fake COVID vaccines? And this was at a time when the vaccines were just being released. And so there were lots of approvals happening at the same time. There were some countries and some entities that approved some, but not others. And so it was a very quickly changing and complex landscape. And I really needed to help get a handle on what was real and what was of concern. And in addition to that was, well, what is actually occurring as tangible incidents of fraud versus fake news? And so partnering with Relative, we came up with the source material of, we want to look at these Twitter handles, we want to look at these news outlets, and these are the terms that we want to be looking for. And so they helped me to really establish what are those good conduits for information. And then we began that tracking study, and it helped us to spot along the way, what are the emerging areas of concern or themes? And then also what is maybe a flash in the pan moment versus an enduring concern. And so that is how we first established and then maintained this study related to the COVID vaccines.
Brilliant, brilliant. Thank you. Yeah, super interesting and remarkable presence of mind in a time of crisis. So well done. Lindsay, same question. No, Lindsay, not Lindsay. We just asked you. Kirsten, same question to you, please.
Sure, thank you. So I am more of a newcomer to Relative Insight. I became aware of the tool and started talking with Relative in the midst of the pandemic. So my client base is entirely higher education. So I work with colleges and universities, and my focus is on student recruitment marketing. So I'm looking at where there are intersections between a college or a university's brand and what their offer is, and where that intersects with students' interest and how they're making their decisions for college enrollment. And pursuing a college degree is a very complex consumer decision. There's a lot of influencers and influences, including what's happening in the world sort of at large, that's influencing how they're thinking about the value of a degree, what their desired outcomes in pursuing a degree are. And this does change sometimes pretty rapidly based on what's happening in the world. So, similar to what Lindsay mentioned, I was really interested in what has changed or is changing about the college decision-making process in light of COVID, and what hasn't changed. What are flashes in the pan that might impact a particular class's 1 year of a recruitment cycle decision-making, and what is going to impact that decision-making in the longer term. So I've worked with Relative now on 2 projects, one on behalf of a particular client, which was launching a new school of public health and health sciences in the midst of a pandemic. So understanding how the national and international understanding of public health and health sciences is changing was really important to helping them establish their brand messaging for their launch. And then more recently, I did a study that was really for thought leadership for my agency to better understand, again, what has changed and what maybe hasn't in the college decision-making process. So we looked at conversations on Reddit over the last 3 years about the college decision-making process and looked at themes that were consistent over time and themes that had changed. And then importantly, how sentiment related to those themes has changed over the course of the last 3 years. So there's been some really interesting findings coming out of both of those projects that have really informed how I'm thinking about the focus of my work more generally with all of my clients. So I found it to be a really valuable partnership.
Brilliant, brilliant. Thank you, Kirsten. That's fab. And finally, Sam, I'm going to shout in your face. What are your experiences of tracking using Relative?
So I think I'm coming at this much more internal focus. So looking at the employee experience angle, and where I've been using Relative across 2 organizations, going back, I think 3 years, is really focused on culture and understanding the cultural drivers that are impacting how people are experiencing work and what that then means for organizations to be successful as well. So really tracking around many different variants of the same basic question of how are you feeling at the moment? So going back a couple of years, probably 18 months, I was at an organization or 2 organizations going through an integration process. So we were looking at comparing how people were feeling on both sides of that process, looking at language around loss, around fear, around optimism, and starting to understand what that was really meaning for how we communicate integration, what we're sort of anticipating being cultural factors that could block some of the success. So yeah, looking at those factors. And then more recently, at a company that's going through hypergrowth at the moment and exploding, and really being very intentional about who we are as a global culture, starting to understand the factors that are impacting people and how we talk about ourselves, what strategies and processes we need to put in place to keep making ourselves a better place to work, to attract people, to retain people, and ultimately deliver customer satisfaction. So it's sort of looking at the impacts on customers, perhaps from the internal perspective rather than the external perspective. And in future, we'd like to sort of start to put them together as well and match together what we're saying about ourselves with what customers are saying about us as well, and hopefully finding that that is parallel to each other.
Lovely, thank you. Brilliant. So as David mentioned earlier, obviously tracking for no purpose is kind of pointless. So I'm really interested in understanding, okay, so we know kind of what you did, but kind of how did you make this insight then actionable? You know, what did you do after you'd kind of discovered those interesting things? And Kirsten, we'll come to you first for that, please.
Sure. I'll focus on the project that I worked on around public health and health sciences, because I think it was really interesting, and the insights that we generated really did directly inform the work that we produced on behalf of our clients. So like I mentioned, this was a launch of a new school of public health and health sciences, and when the launch of a school takes quite a long time to bring to fruition. So this initiative was underway long before the pandemic, and I think that from a branding and marketing perspective, which is my focus, there was the anticipation that a lot of the messaging and marketing needs for this launch would be around defining what public health is, and why it may be a viable or even really appealing career path for people who have certain interests. And then on the health sciences front, I think there's a general understanding that health sciences and allied health fields are really successful career paths for people interested in health and in the sciences. And so we were sort of thinking about how can we marry this opportunity of the need to raise awareness about one aspect of this school, and to really leverage the knowledge that already was in the market about the other aspect of the school. And so then obviously when COVID hit and we were really engaged in thinking about how is this actually going to come to life now in light of what's going on, we did listening with Relative Insight to identify, you know, where has this awareness and sentiment changed, and how will that inform our branding and messaging? And so obviously on the public health side, we went from the anticipation that there would be little to no awareness of the realities of public health. People may have heard of the term, but not know exactly what it means or what a career in public health might look like, to you know, a strong sense of what a public health official might be and what they might do, but laced with skepticism and distrust and fear, and a new understanding of what the tolls of working in that field might be, and that it's something that would require some serious consideration as a potential career path. And same on the health sciences field, that the toll taken on nurses and first frontline and first responders was front and center. So what had previously been considered a really promising career path with lots of opportunity for the whole duration of your career, now people were really aware of burnout and of the health risks to themselves and their families of pursuing careers in this field. So our messaging strategy shifted entirely based on our understanding of those sentiments, as well as overlaying the increasing awareness of inequities in healthcare and health outcomes in the world, that really tapping into how public health and health science professionals can address those inequities going forward, and how an education right now in those fields can make differences in ways that people hadn't really necessarily connected the dots on previously. So it gave us a lot of direction for developing the core messaging for the launch of this new brand.
Lovely, thank you. And Lindsay, I saw some raised eyebrows there, so I'm sure you can shed some light on that. But I guess same to you, you know, how did you make this kind of the things you found, but, you know, through misinformation, how did you turn that into action?
Certainly, and yes, I can relate to much greater awareness of public health and the different components that we all work on as kind of the underpinnings so that people can trust medicines and the quality of those. And it's been interesting having more people join the conversation than we ever expected. But certainly I can relate to having perhaps an initial idea of what the issues are, what the sentiments are, but then actually doing that listening. And this is part of what I love about the approach that we took with Relative. It removes some of the bias that I might bring just in what I'm assuming is language as somebody who lives in the East Coast of the United States, and actually listens to how are people talking about it themselves. And so we adjusted some of our terms along the way, just based on what we were seeing in the coverage. But a specific action point, you know, other than just being sharper about how we monitor, it was noticing when there was an instance of fake vaccines. So we had a couple of these occur, one in Mexico, one in India. And each time we responded a little bit differently to understand, well, what is needed here to alleviate the problem. And in the case of India, we had a set of inspection norms or visual inspection guide. So these are focused towards the practitioner that the ministry can provide to frontline health workers. Look through these things when you're receiving shipment of COVID vaccine. The label should look like this. It should have these kinds of packaging materials. If any of that is disturbed, here's what we recommend. Put it, you know, in refrigeration and then investigate further. So we shared those recommendations with the Indian Ministry of Health, and then they passed them on to the frontline health workers. And so we were able to do all of that in pretty rapid succession. And part of that was informed by the previous work with Mexico in learning what is valuable at the time of an incident of fake medicine. So it's been, I think, a laddering kind of process. We learn from one incident, we use that to inform the next one, and then follow up to understand what was beneficial, what perhaps wasn't, what are those unique gaps. And the timeliness was really what was so special about using the tracking study, that we could see, okay, there's something happening that's different than last month, and be right on top of it.
Brilliant. Thank you, Lindsay. I absolutely love that a finding from Relative Insight impacted, you know, lives in India. That's pretty cool. Sam, to you, how did you make the insights that you discovered through this in employee experience study actionable?
So I think similar to what Kirsten was saying, like focusing on the messaging and how we're steering the messaging, correcting the course, and listening to people and playing back some of the insights that we're getting. So there's very explicit messaging. So to David's point about understanding what's a trend and what's a flashpoint. With the flashpoints, you know, we learned along the way through an integration process that people were really focused on equality and inclusion and diversity, but specifically equality of car parking. And car parking was a big hot button issue for people. And so there's a really simple kind of policy message and communication that goes along with that as well. But also refocusing on the silent communicators and looking at the trends and sort of nudging our communications or being very intentional about leadership messaging. So Organization X, we know I'm trying to anonymize my sources here, but Organization X, you know, we noticed a trend of language related to maybe fear, hostility, talking about takeover perceptions. Organization Y, sort of much more positive and optimistic. So yeah, the silent communicator with that, just as a micro example, is making sure that we always refer to Organization X before Organization Y when we're putting them together in our integration communications, or when we're pulling the positive examples, what we want to see, pull it from Organization X rather than Organization Y, and just sort of trying to allay some of those fears and focus a little bit on, you know, where we're pulling the sources from in order to send that sort of silent message that both are equal. This isn't takeover, this is integration. So how I sort of use it in terms of actionable insight is by going around and knocking on various doors. So the internal communications door, the head of equity and impact door, the directors, the CEO, and say, this is where we might want to nuance some of the messaging, or this is where we might want to make some of these things explicit, or this is where we might want to play back when we're looking at our survey results to the whole organisation, what we've heard and what we're doing about it. So it's explicit and implicit messaging that goes along with it.
Brilliant, fantastic, and I absolutely love the subtleties there from Insight. That's brilliant. Excuse me. Coming straight back to you, Sam. What attributes do you think that you need in order to be able to track reliably and accurately?
I think that the main attribute, you need methodological rigor, you need a great tool, you need a sort of process around it. You need an audience who understands and who are on board, and you need a receptive audience. You need people who are going to sort of be on board with the messaging and listen. And so building up, I guess, the confidence in Relative, and that's something in both organisations I've worked at, we've worked quite hard at, is to position Relative as a sort of tool for advisory purposes and something we can trust to help with the nuance and help find the subtleties. So I think that's the first sort of attribute that we really need. And then a sort of consistency of how we're gathering data. So in my world, I rely very heavily on employee surveying. So at least quarterly, sort of pulling comments, verbatim from employee surveys, engagement surveys, like I say, sort of specifically around questions like, how are you feeling right now? Or do you see a path to advance your career in the organisation? Or I can be my authentic self at work, and making sure that we have some sort of consistency over time with what we're focusing on as well. But I'd say the end point is making sure we have a stakeholder network who are increasingly confident. And what tends to happen is people start coming to me to say, can we feed this into Relative and pull this out? And so that sort of advisory perspective, I feel is the most important thing.
Great, thank you. And Lindsay, we'll come to you next. So what do you think you need to be able to track reliably and accurately?
A lot that's similar to what Sam shared, and certainly it helped with the credibility when I would then make recommendations based on the insights that I could say, this is what we are hearing from a variety of key opinion leaders or major news outlets. This is understanding the different tiers of sources. So sometimes we would see this bubbling up just from general Twitter discussion. And that is kind of one piece, but it's not like I'm going to be leading with, well, Joe in Nebraska says this. But again, it's having that breadth and understanding what are those really particular leaders that you absolutely have to have their sentiment included in the overall mix. And so that was one piece of it. And it's also, the duration, the timeliness. So we settled on monthly, and that was kind of figuring out, well, what is that right cadence for something significant enough to have changed, but not so frequent that we are just forever batting away different blips. And that was tricky. It took some figuring out. But that's why we went monthly versus quarterly versus weekly. And so that was another piece. And I think it's certainly distinct to the particular project and how much your market or your landscape is changing, how volatile it is.
Great, thank you. And Kirsten, finally to you.
Yeah, one of the things that I was thinking about in relation to this idea of what you need to be able to track kind of goes back to the opening comments about if you track everything, you're tracking nothing, or you won't get actionable insights out of it at the very least. And so one of the things that is really important to me, and part of what we are at Lipman Hearne are trying to do for our clients, is to help them elevate their conversations and the perceptions of their stakeholders of a college degree above sort of a commodity decision-making process, that we do not want this decision-making to become all about price. And I know that, especially from my conversations with my colleagues at Relative, I know that decision-making about higher education is extremely different between the US and the UK. So I'm very much speaking from a US perspective here, but one of the things that I think can be really helpful to setting up tracking that will be reliable and accurate over time is really understanding what to track and identifying the attributes of higher education that will get a school into a student's consideration set. Things that they have to know that a school offers to be willing to even consider it as an option. And in some cases, those are really what we sort of call table stakes attributes, that they're something that absolutely every college or university can claim and that they're not differentiated at all. So we need to strike that balance between how do we track and monitor what students and their influencers' perception of those sort of table stake attributes are for an institution. And then what are the attributes of a school that are going to be truly differentiating? What is unique to them? What can they offer to a student and their family that will be different and that will be something they can position themselves based on? So part of our process in setting up tracking is doing a lot of preliminary work to really understand what is the right balance of things to track perceptions on between those sort of basic attributes and those more differentiating and unique attributes, so that we can get a really full and useful picture of how sentiment or perceptions may be changing over time about a particular institution, so that we can build a plan to address changes if they're moving in the wrong direction, or to leverage changes that are moving in the right direction. So I think really setting up what you're tracking and making sure that it's really relevant and important to both your client or your institution and their audience is part of what is the recipe for success in my mind.
Lovely, that's great. And we'll stay with you, Kirsten, for the next one, actually. What would you say that the benefits are of incorporating text analysis into kind of your insight work?
Yeah, it's been really interesting to me, and Lindsay, I think, mentioned this in one of her previous comments as well, that it's a chance to potentially to sort of step outside my own perspective and think about potential bias, and also to validate or redirect things we might be hypothesizing based on other methodologies or conclusions. So I think it's a really interesting layer to building my understanding for my clients of what's happening in the market, and it adds just a very different perspective and also a real richness to the understanding, that especially when we're thinking about quantitative inputs, and those can really help define current state of understanding or perceptions. And I think adding text analysis over that gives just so much more depth to what's really happening in people's minds and what they're talking about and what's important to them, that gives a lot of context and nuance that is really valuable.
Lovely, thank you. That's great. And Sam, I guess same to you. What would you say are the benefits of incorporating text analysis?
So loads of benefits, and I think just backing up exactly what Kirsten said there, the objectivity is hugely important. So again, sort of the world I deal in a lot of time is with engagement surveying. I think sort of traditional approach is organisations do their surveys and then it's left to a manager or a leader somewhere to read through all the comments, to 200 comments, and invariably there's an emotional reaction to the first negative comment, and I think stripping out some of that emotional reaction and stripping out some of that subjectivity, and as Kirsten said, some of the bias as well, is really important, just introducing some objectivity to it, but also providing the context as well. So I think we can collect the numbers one, quantitative. Yeah, that one. So we can collect the quantitative data, and the numbers kind of give you a situation.
Yes, you don't need that, you need text.
Yeah, I always get my numbers one and the words one wrong way around.
That's all right. All about qual these days.
Well, that's where we are. So, like, focusing on the numbers will sort of point you in a direction and sort of give you a high level picture. But the qualitative, I think, provides the nuance and provides the context and the depth and the richness, exactly as Kirsten says. So I think another benefit is being able to sort of look at hypotheses around some of the big themes. So in terms of experience and engagement, we know meaning, autonomy, growth, impact, connection are the big things. So we can start to test some hypotheses around this by going into relative and looking at what people are talking about. But also in Collibra, we talk a lot about paper cuts and looking for the little small things that happen each day that just tend to irritate people and probably on their own aren't enough for people to leave. But once you have 1,000 cuts, that might sort of start to damage or cause attrition. So beginning to surface them and also situate them in the organization as well. So we know people can get frustrated with procurement, but where's that most pronounced, and what can we do to address it? Or people get annoyed about searching for information on the intranet. Where's that sort of happening? So to surface some of the smaller things which probably would be missed as well, certainly if you're just looking at quantitative scores. And that sort of, I think, gives us somewhere to start work and somewhere to focus as well, and also gives us a reason to partner with leaders across different parts of the organization and really target what we're doing with programs and support as well.
Lovely. And Lindsay, we will come to you. I just want to give a reminder to everyone online just to submit your questions for the panel. If you have any, we will be coming to the Q&A. So Lindsay, benefits of incorporating text analysis.
Certainly. And it was interesting that I certainly drew on a lot of different sources and resources to inform the COVID response. And what uniquely I appreciated about using relative was that it helped me to understand what the tone of public conversation was, and that we weren't just getting blinders on and tone deaf to what people cared about. And this can be a risk, I think, with public health experts, that you have people who have such deep scientific expertise, and they will see, well, here's what we need to do to resolve a particular problem. And it's a very practical scientific approach, but it might not have the understanding of how do you communicate that in a way that resonates with the people you need to convince to take that approach. Your expertise is well noted, but that's not always enough to convince people of what needs to be done. So that's where you say, we are seeing a widespread concern. We are seeing mistrust. We are seeing actually that people are reassured by X. And so it's not just on the negative side, but when we see positives, what are the surrounding factors, like Sam said, what else goes into that? And so for me, it's very much a helpful gut check on things, confirming hypotheses, but also broadening our view. So it's not just kind of the internal experts talking to experts and not realizing that we've kind of formed a little vacuum.
Lovely, thank you. So obviously we've touched on some other methodologies in the form of quant, but I guess I'm just interested to hear your views on complementary methodologies for tracking alongside the text analysis efforts that you've all sort of done, I guess. So Kirsten, we'll come to you first.
Great. Yeah, I think when thinking about tracking over time, one thing that we do for some clients is a longitudinal assessment of perceptions of their brand. And historically, we've done that almost entirely with quant, that we do surveys of important segments of the market to assess their current perceptions of the brand and then look at changes over time. And we design these surveys, like I mentioned, to touch on things that are important to that brand. So in some cases, it's very, very specific of if a school had a reputation as a party school 20 years ago, a place that wasn't serious about academics, and that that could be a problem for certain students, but that may or may not hold true 20 years later in reality, but the perception may linger. So we may ask about that in surveys to understand, is that still a perception of the particular school? And then I think that adding qualitative or adding text analysis can just add that additional detail and that understanding of, if there are misperceptions, why are they there? It can help get to the why, I think, in a way that that survey data or qualitative in general doesn't get to as strongly. So I think that pairing qual and quant can help you identify what those trends are, as well as start to get to the why of why it's happening, why there might be changes. And again, move us towards insights that are actionable, and then what can we do about it? So I think that layering different methodologies can really build that more useful analysis.
Wonderful, thank you. And Lindsay, same to you.
I would say my experience, certainly there's the value of pulling these different approaches together. It takes some skill and expertise. You need people who can appreciate where those things are good fits. What do you use the qual for? What do you use the quant for? And where you recognize maybe there's some gaps, and so you want to fill those in. It's certainly a bit of an art. And a couple different things that we did with the COVID work. For example, when we mentioned that the issue in India and we pointed them to a resource, we would monitor our downloads and access points to those different resources. So if we knew there's a blip, we took this action, did we see the pickup? Did we see the follow through of people utilizing those resources? So that was one, but then also we did a survey of those who had downloaded the resources. Did it meet your need? Was it unique information? Because we don't want to just duplicate what they can get elsewhere. And if they had feedback for us. So, it was this kind of sequence, and then going back and integrating the feedback into our updates, into our messaging and response behaviors. So, it's kind of this engine with all these different parts, and again, having an understanding of what each part serves in the overall design, and where is that car going? Where is the direction we're going? And always understanding your objectives and being clear on those consistently. And if you need to change directions, okay, we're doing that with intent and clarity, and not just feeling reactive all the time.
Wonderful, thank you, Lindsay. And Sam, same question to you.
Sure. So again, coming from probably more of an internal engagement experience perspective, I think for tracking, for monitoring, for taking action, nothing is ever going to be better than conversation and dialogue, and managers having good conversations with their teams, and sometimes difficult conversations, sometimes nice conversations. So that's always going to be the gold standard. And I think our job from employee experience is giving people as much as possible to set up those conversations and to give people something to talk around as well. So the objectivity, the paper cut side of things, the trends that are the flashpoints that are coming as a result of the qual analytics, but also with the data that we're picking up through the qual side as well. So engagement scores and wellbeing scores and belonging scores, but also looking at turnover rates and female representation and attrition statistics and all those other things. So it's kind of the pieces of the jigsaw that fit together to enable and empower managers and leaders to have really effective, focused conversations. And I think it's through the dialogue that we really start to see the actions happen and come to life. And from a cultural point of view as well, it's the behaviour changes that go along with that. And so the feedback element, which helps people kind of course correct and focus on the behaviours that contribute to the culture and what people experience. So I think there's a lot of complementary methodologies there that go into it.
Wonderful, thank you. Okay, so final question for the panel before we get on to some of these Q&As. Lindsay, can you share your favorite or most unexpected linguistic insight?
You know, it's funny. We've gotten so many different odd moments in the different insights that came through. And, you know, one that was particularly odd was there was one doctor, well, not really a doctor, there was one handle on Twitter kind of spreading some misinformation, and they were just popping into all these different accounts and basically tweeting themselves, quoting themselves to make something look like, you know, a bigger issue than it really was. And so it was just funny because it came through, and at first you're like, oh gosh, there's a problem here. There's some quality issue. And then when you dig, you're like, it's the same quack just sitting here mouthing off. That's not really anything. And I was so glad that we could dig to that level and then dismiss it. But that one I did not expect.
Brilliant. And Sam, most unexpected or surprising insight?
I think we look a lot at organizational lexicon. Again, it's a really big marker of culture, how people talk about organizations. So yeah, I love the car parking example as something that really was genuinely emotive for a lot of people that we would have completely missed. And we had a similar sort of case around catering as well. You know, things that really matter to people underneath, and also levels of formality as well. So looking at an integration process, one organization talking a lot of formality, you know, with words related to formal dress and home office setup and hierarchy and deference to leadership, and one organization being sort of much more around flexible working, remoteness, you know, lots of terminology around being casual, and starting to stitch those things together and find a common ground that works for both kind of communication styles, I think is, yeah, that was really important, certainly from a communication point of view. And one thing I like at the place I am at the moment is, it's maybe not a surprise, but I think it's a nice thing. The fact that the word great comes up something like 1,000 times more than you would expect the word great to come up compared to standard English. So, yeah, whenever we look at the frequencies, it's always great job, great people, great work, great place. And that's kind of, yeah, a really nice, reassuring thing to pull out and play back to people as well. So maybe not too unexpected, but I thought it's a nice thing.
For me, it's the car parking. It's quite surprising.
People really care about car parking.
I'm going to put a note into manager and relative. I need a space in central London. Kirsten, yours, please. Unexpected or favorite insight?
Sure. So in the study we were doing about conversations and perceptions of the college application process over the last few years, one of the things we really wanted to understand is how students who are going through this application process right now are feeling about it, what the emotions that they're expressing are. And we expected that there would be, you know, anxiety and stress and frustration, and we saw all of that, and there were a lot of positive emotions too. But one of the things that I found surprising and interesting is, especially among what we call high achieving students who are applying to really selective competitive schools and who are sort of immersed in this college application process for years potentially before they make that final decision. The assessment identified a lot of anger and also grief about this process, that for students who are seniors in high school right now in the US, they started their college search process before the pandemic started. And so they had been planning how to sort of optimize their high school experience towards a college that was their dream school for years. And then COVID hit, and the way the application process has proceeded has changed dramatically because of the pandemic. And so for these students, they felt like the game changed when they were in the middle of it, that the rules changed and that it wasn't fair, and that it was sort of a personal affront to all of this work that they had put in potentially over years to get the grades and the test scores and all of the other elements that are necessary to get into really selective schools. And one of the quotes that that was pulled out in the assessment that I've used a lot in talking about this issue with my colleagues is a student said in their online conversation that the college application process this year was a bloodbath. And that level of sort of that descriptive element I was not expecting. And gives us some really important insight into the emotions and how we can help support students who are feeling this way, who are feeling that there's this sort of unfairness and that the rules changed on them, that sort of acknowledging those really strong emotions, I think, can help schools connect with these students better, to say, we see you and we understand how this must feel for you. So that idea of it being a bloodbath really jumped out at me.
Amazing, thank you. Okay, so we are now going to move on to the Q&A section. So those in the room, have a little think about your questions, but we've got some come through from the online folks. So the first one we have that has come in, and I'm going to direct this to Lindsay. So how do you know that you've been successful? So you've done your tracking and you've made it actionable, but how do you know that that's, you know, been successful in your actions?
Certainly. This was a always moving target over the past couple of years. So something that would have ranked as a success at March of last year might not qualify as a success now. Now we're looking for bigger impact or a more mature kind of program. But I would say it goes back to that assertion, you have to know what your objective is with doing the tracking study. And so if, for me, the success was being responsive to and averting quality issues with the COVID vaccines. So if I'm not seeing a whole lot of incidents and Interpol seizures and things of fake COVID vaccine, then I'm feeling pretty good that our safety net is working and that those interventions are working. But it's pairing the lack of news with those frontline anecdotes or stories of, yes, we are using the tools, they are helpful, we appreciate them. It's not feeling like you have us looking at the wrong things or that these aren't the right approaches, we're still missing something. So that's my crystal ball reading.
Lovely, thank you. And Kirsten, to you now, what do you think is kind of the current perception of the industry, generally speaking, towards text analysis? And if it's not good or if there's not much known about it, what can we do to kind of change that perception? And should we?
Yeah, I think that so if I start at a pretty small, very specific level for my specific client base of colleges and universities, I think there's a tremendous amount of interest in new ways to gather audience insights. That when the audience that we are generally speaking to are teenagers. Adult students are becoming an increasingly important part of the audience, but I'll put them to the side for just a second. And when we're talking about understanding teenagers and how they're taking in information, how they're assessing information, how they're building their understanding of ultimately a consumer decision, I think that there's a real hunger for new ways to do that, to tap into what they're thinking and how we can better connect with them. So I think there's a tremendous amount of interest. I think the issue, I think, is that there's a perception that using tools like this might not be accessible financially for nonprofit organizations and for smaller organizations, that they won't have the budget to access tools like this, which isn't necessarily true. So I think there's an opportunity to share more broadly that this kind of assessment doesn't have to be cost prohibitive for institutions. And I think actually I started out talking about colleges and universities, but my broader audience of clients are all nonprofits of various sorts. And I think the same holds true, that there's always an interest in better understanding audiences, and that new tools to be able to do that and do it in really meaningful ways that that do get to the emotional drivers of decision making. There's a real value there, and in an understanding of that value, it's just a matter of, is this something I actually can afford with my institution's budget?
Brilliant, thank you. And Sam, one final question in one or two sentences, because we have a final bit that we don't want people to miss. But how easy did you find it to convince stakeholders of your approach, and kind of what tips and tricks would you share for others trying to do the same?
It's difficult in two sentences.
Do your best.
Easy with some stakeholders, borderline impossible with others, is the two sentences. I think it's really got to demonstrate the value. I think, for me, it was pushing and probing to find the open doors, and then using that to sort of broaden out to persuade other people. So it's very much a sort of starting small and getting the ball rolling. I feel that for me, this is kind of an emerging field, a new thing. It's sort of standalone a little bit. So it's just finding people one by one and working on stakeholder by stakeholder, rather than trying to get everyone at once.
Lovely, lovely. The personalized approach is the way forward. Wonderful. Thank you so much, panelists. I'm going to hand back to David now.
Wonderful. Well, thank you everybody for joining us today. That was a tremendously insightful conversation, as I'm sure you can agree. I hope everybody, found at least a few things that they can take back, incorporate into your day-to-day, and help you in all your tracking endeavors. So with that, just a couple things to wrap up on here. We mentioned before that we have launched our very own tracking solution. We've rolled it out with some existing customers. Very shortly, we're going to be launching it with new customers as well. If you're interested in learning about Heartbeat, Amy is your person. You can contact her at amy@relativeinsight.com. Really easy to remember. So if you have any questions, if you want a demo, if you just want to chat more about this, Amy would be more than happy to do that. So please do get in touch. And last but certainly not least, I'm very excited to introduce Tech Summit. So we're really looking forward to this one-day event. It's here in London on Wednesday, the 29th of June. And this is going to be a one-day conference completely dedicated to all things text analytics. So it's going to be a fantastic day. For those of you in the UK, we'd love to see you in person. It's going to be in true relative fashion. It's going to be a really interesting day, and then there's going to be a nice social at the end as well. So more information will be forthcoming, but save the date, and we'd love to see you there. Once again, a big thank you to our panelists for joining us today, and for everyone who's been here in the room with us, and to Amy for moderating our panel. Thank you all so much, and we hope to see you all again soon. Cheers.